Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I want to talk to you about something most people believe is impossible. Something they've given up on, cried over, begged for, and often convinced themselves they will never receive. Avoidants only apologize when you stop needing their apology, because the paradox of the avoidant mind is simple. The more you seek emotional validation from them, the more they retreat into emotional self-protection. They are wired to interpret your longing as pressure, your vulnerability as a threat, your need for closure as a demand they don't know how to meet. When you are reaching, explaining, arguing, pleading, or trying to make them understand your pain, they are not hearing you. They are defending themselves from the intensity of emotion they never learned to process. So long as you need their apology, they stay in avoidance mode, not because they don't feel guilt, but because they don't feel safe enough to face it. Avoidants have an internal narrative they repeat to themselves. If I admit I hurt you, I become responsible for fixing it. And responsibility terrifies them. Accountability requires emotional presence, self-reflection, and vulnerability. Three things they have spent years building walls against. So when you stand in front of them asking for something that demands emotional depth, they freeze, they shut down, they withdraw, they stonewall. They detach not because you are wrong, but because their nervous system interprets your emotional need as danger. In that moment, they are not thinking, I hurt this person. They are thinking, I can't handle this. And so the apology never comes. But something powerful happens when you stop needing that apology. When you stop chasing clarity, stop pushing for acknowledgement, stop demanding emotional reciprocity. Your detachment signals that you no longer require them for emotional stability. And that shift is what creates the psychological space avoidants need to reflect. Because avoidants do not process emotions in real time. They process in hindsight, in solitude, and only when the emotional threat is past. Your emotional independence removes the threat. It gives them the room to feel instead of react. It gives them the room to think instead of defend. And for the first time, they begin to understand the impact of their actions. When you stop needing their apology, the energy dynamic flips. You are no longer the one pursuing emotional closure. You become the one who already created it for yourself. You no longer hand them the power to soothe you. You are no longer standing at the emotional doorway asking them to open it. You walk through your own door. You reclaim the part of yourself that once depended on their validation. And this shift forces them to see what they could not see before, that your strength was never in how deeply you felt for them, but in how courageously you move forward without them. Avoidants often assume you will stay attached even after they withdraw. They convince themselves you'll continue hoping, waiting, suffering, and reaching. This belief protects them from guilt because it allows them to think they'll be fine. But when you are no longer needing their apology, you break that illusion. You show them that the emotional weight is no longer yours to carry. And that's when their guilt finally surfaces. That's when their conscience wakes up. That's when the memories of what they did begin to sting. They no longer feel shielded by your attachment. They feel exposed by your independence. The moment you stop needing an apology is also the moment they realize they might not get another chance. Avoidants don't fear intimacy as much as they fear losing emotional access without having a say. Your detachment places them in a position they cannot emotionally tolerate: uncertainty. They begin to question whether you still care, whether you still feel, whether you still remember them with tenderness or with indifference. And nothing wounds an avoidant more than the idea of being emotionally replaced in your mind. That fear becomes the catalyst for self-reflection, and self-reflection becomes the doorway to accountability. When you stop needing their apology, you also stop cushioning the consequences of their actions. You stop absorbing the blame. You stop owning their emotional mess. You stop protecting them from the truth of who they were. Avoidants only understand their impact when the person they hurt no longer stands there, holding their pain out like an offering. Your emotional distance forces them to sit with the discomfort instead of shoving it onto you. And when avoidants sit with discomfort long enough, responsibility begins to bloom. They start to admit to themselves what they never said out loud. They begin to empathize with you in ways they couldn't when they felt overwhelmed. The irony is that the apology you once begged for becomes the apology they finally want to give, not because you asked, but because you stopped asking. Not because you needed it, but because they suddenly feel compelled to offer it. And that motivation comes from a place of genuine acknowledgement, not defensiveness. Avoidants apologize when the emotional battlefield is clear, when the fear of confrontation has dissolved, when the person they hurt is no longer emotionally dependent on them. In that clarity, they can finally see the truth of their actions. The apology arrives not because you demanded it, but because you created the emotional distance that allowed them to find it inside themselves. And that is why avoidants only apologize when you stop needing their apology, because your emotional freedom becomes the mirror that finally shows them everything they couldn't face while you were still reaching for them. Your emotional independence forces them to confront themselves because, for the first time, you remove the emotional cushion that allowed them to hide from the consequences of their behavior. Avoidants live their entire lives using distance as a shield that protects them from vulnerability, accountability, and emotional exposure. As long as you were emotionally dependent on them, as long as your feelings reacted to their withdrawal, as long as your self-worth was tied to their attention, they never had to face who they were in the relationship. Your dependency softened the truth. Your reactions absorbed the blame. Your pain protected them from their own guilt. But emotional independence takes all of that away. Suddenly, there is no shield left for them to hide behind. Avoidants are not incapable of emotion. They are incapable of sitting with emotion when someone else is expressing it toward them. Your need for reassurance overwhelmed them, but your emotional neutrality unsettles them even more. When you detach, they lose the predictable emotional pattern they relied on. They can no longer assume that their silence will pull you closer. They can no longer expect that their distance will make you try harder. They can no longer count on your tears, your questions, or your pleas to remind them of their importance. Instead, they are left with the one thing they fear the most, a quiet space where your emotions no longer echo around them. That quiet forces them inward, and avoidants do not like going inward. Inward is where their guilt lives. Inward is where their unhealed wounds live. Inward is where they must face the fact that they hurt someone who cared deeply. Your emotional independence shines a light directly into the corners they have avoided their entire lives. They begin to see the patterns they repeated. The defensiveness, the avoidance, the inconsistency, the coldness, the withdrawal. They begin to see how their behavior was not protecting the relationship, but sabotaging it. They start to understand how their fear of intimacy created the very outcome they feared, losing someone safe, loyal, and emotionally invested. Your independence also removes the illusion of control they once held. Avoidants rely on emotional imbalance, the sense that they feel less, want less, need less. This gives them a sense of safety because it prevents vulnerability. But when you detach emotionally, you take away the imbalance. You level the ground. You rise to a place within yourself where you no longer require their validation, attention, or presence to feel whole. And this terrifies them because it leaves them in an unfamiliar emotional position. They are now the one who feels more. They are now the one wondering. They are now the one uncertain. They are now the one who fears losing access to your heart. When you become emotionally independent, they no longer have the power to trigger you. Their silence no longer wobbles your stability. Their mixed signals no longer confuse your identity. Their inconsistency no longer holds emotional weight. They begin to see that the emotional leverage they once used, whether consciously or unconsciously, no longer works. And that realization forces them to ask the questions they've avoided. Why did this person need me so much before? And why don't they now? That question becomes the crack in their emotional armor. It forces them to revisit the memories they avoided processing. It forces them to consider the pain they caused. It forces them to sit with the guilt they never acknowledged. Emotional independence also exposes the truth about what they lost, not just a partner, but an emotional anchor. Avoidants struggle to form deep attachments, so when someone genuinely loving disconnects emotionally, The avoidant feels a shift they cannot easily replace. They sense the emotional difference immediately. They notice the absence. They notice the lifting of your energy. They notice the silence. They notice the peace you now have without them. And they begin to envy it. This envy is not malicious, it is reflective. It reveals their internal lack, their emotional immaturity, and the deep truth that they were the one incapable of meeting the level of love you offered. Your emotional independence doesn't punish them. It awakens them. It creates a moment where they must finally confront the emotional reality they've always avoided. Without your reactions to hide behind, they are forced to feel the weight of their choices. Without your emotional dependence, they are forced to recognize the distance they created. Without your need for closeness, they are forced to confront their own fear of intimacy. And it is in this confrontation, this quiet, internal, uncomfortable awakening, that genuine remorse is born. Avoidants do not apologize because someone asks them to. They apologize when they are emotionally confronted by the truth of who they were. And emotional independence is the first moment in their life when they are left alone with that truth long enough to finally feel it. Your silence becomes the mirror they cannot escape, because silence is the one thing an avoidant cannot outrun, argue with, or hide behind. Avoidants are experts at dodging emotional truth. They avoid confrontation, they avoid vulnerability, they avoid accountability, and they avoid anything that forces them to look at themselves clearly. But silence, your silence, removes all the noise that once protected them. It removes the arguments they could use to deflect. It removes the emotional intensity they could use to justify withdrawal. It removes the blame they could project back onto you. When you stop speaking, they lose their shield. And in that absence of sound, they are finally confronted with something far more powerful, the echo of their own behavior. You must understand that avoidants don't reflect when you are talking. They defend. They shut down. They wall off. They listen to react, not to understand. In the moment, your words feel like emotional pressure, not emotional truth. But silence removes their ability to defend. Without your voice filling the space, their own mind becomes louder. Their own guilt becomes clearer. Their own patterns become unavoidable. The silence you leave behind becomes the space where self-awareness begins to form, slowly, painfully, and inevitably. In silence, they can no longer escape the memories, the ignored messages, the cold replies, the distance they created, the moments you cried and they went numb, the times you reached out and they disappeared, the softness you offered and the withdrawal they chose. Silence forces them to replay these moments not as a threat to their autonomy, but as evidence of their own emotional immaturity. This is the first time they hear themselves clearly, their tone, their carelessness, their defensiveness, their avoidant logic that once made sense now begins to crack under the weight of reflection. And here is the truth: avoidants would never admit silence scares them. They pretend it doesn't. They pretend they prefer distance. They pretend they are more comfortable alone. But silence from someone who loved them is not peace. It is exposure. It exposes the fact that they may have pushed too far. It exposes the reality that they may not be forgiven this time. It exposes their deepest fear, that your emotional world may have finally closed its doors to them, and their ego does not know how to survive that level of uncertainty. Your silence also dismantles the fantasy they use to protect themselves. Avoidants survive emotionally by believing that you'll always be there, waiting, hoping, hurting, reaching. This belief comforts them because it keeps intimacy at a distance while still giving them a sense of emotional importance. But when you go silent, that fantasy collapses. Suddenly, they can no longer assume that you're still longing for them. They can no longer assume that they still hold space in your heart. They can no longer assume that their presence is still desired. Your silence forces them into a confrontation with the possibility that they have truly lost you. And because avoidants are emotionally delayed, the impact of silence lands slowly but deeply. They don't break on day one. They break when the silence stretches long enough that their mind starts filling in the blanks. They begin wondering what you're doing, who you're talking to, whether you're healing, whether you're forgetting, whether someone better is stepping in. Silence becomes the birthplace of their anxiety. the very anxiety you once carried alone. Now, without your emotional presence to reassure them, they must face the uncertainty they once put you through. In that space, they begin to see the truth. They were not protecting themselves from you. They were running from their own fear. They were not avoiding the relationship. They were avoiding their own vulnerability. They were not distancing because you were too much. They were distancing because they didn't know how to love without feeling exposed. Silence forces them to confront these truths, not because you wanted to punish them, but because you stopped cushioning their emotional shortcomings. Your silence becomes the first time they feel the emotional consequences they once pushed onto you. And that is when remorse begins. That is when they start to understand what you endured. That is when they realize the depth of your love and the pain of their behavior. Silence doesn't just create accountability, it creates clarity. And clarity is what makes avoidants finally understand the truth they ran from. They hurt someone who loved them deeply, and your silence is the moment they finally feel the weight of that loss. That mirror, your silence, shows them exactly who they were. And once they see themselves clearly, they cannot unsee it. Your healing and glow up trigger their recognition of your value. Because avoidants don't understand what they had when you were giving everything. They understand it when you stop giving. They don't recognize your love when you're pouring it into them. They recognize it when you pour it back into yourself. And the irony is brutal. The more you suffered, the more comfortable they were. The more you chased, the more secure they felt. The more you tried to fix things, the more they retreated. But the moment you start healing, the moment you reclaim your power, the moment your energy shifts from longing to self-worth, something inside them cracks in a way they didn't expect and cannot control. Avoidants are not emotionally blind. They are emotionally delayed. They process the meaning of your actions long after the moment has passed. They understand your importance only in hindsight. As long as you were available, expressive, forgiving, and emotionally open, they underestimated you. They convinced themselves they could return any time, pick up where things left off, and you'd still be there waiting with softness in your eyes. But healing destroys that fantasy. Healing rewrites your identity in their mind. You go from someone who needed them to someone who no longer does. And that transition shakes their ego and their emotional world more than any confrontation or argument ever could. Your glow up is not just physical. It's spiritual, emotional, energetic. It's the peace you carry now. It's the self-respect in your boundaries. It's the calm in your presence. It's the absence of the pain they once caused. And avoidants notice this shift immediately. They may act indifferent, they may pretend they've moved on, but inside, they feel the loss. Not of you, but of the version of you that once made their life easier. They realize you were their emotional anchor, the one who held the connection together, the one who brought warmth to the spaces they kept cold, the one who softened their rough edges without judging them. And now they see you becoming someone emotionally secure, someone more grounded, someone peaceful, someone who is no longer drowning in the chaos they created. It exposes a truth they never wanted to face. They weren't protecting themselves by pulling away. They were preventing themselves from experiencing real love. And your glow up becomes the proof. Avoidants often convince themselves that you'll struggle without them, that your heart won't know how to let go, that your life will stay orbiting around the relationship they couldn't commit to. But when you heal, when you rise, when you become centered and strong, it forces them to confront the illusion they lived in. They must accept that they never broke you. You broke free. They must accept that your worth was never tied to their behavior. Only your wounds were. And once the wounds close, your true value shines in a way they can no longer ignore. Your glow up also highlights their stagnation. While you were evolving, they were hiding. While you were healing, they were avoiding. While you were growing, they were staying exactly the same. And avoidants do not handle comparison well, especially when it reveals their emotional immaturity. Watching you improve becomes a painful reminder of their own limitations. Your progress acts like a spotlight, exposing everything they refuse to work on: their fear of intimacy, their inability to communicate, their emotional walls, their unresolved trauma. But the deepest crack in their ego comes from this realization. You became everything they secretly wanted, but never believed they deserved. And now someone else will benefit from the emotional version of you that they rejected. Your healing becomes undeniable proof of your value, and your glow up becomes undeniable proof of their mistake. Avoidants do not admit this out loud. Their pride won't allow it, but internally they feel the sting, because they thought distance would make them feel safe. Instead, distance showed them exactly what they lost. Your glow up turns into a mirror. It shows them the rare kind of love they took for granted. It shows them the emotional maturity they never matched. It shows them the partner you could still be for someone else. And in that moment, they understand something their fear never let them see before. You were not just another person in their life. You were the person who tried to love them past their wounds. When you heal, they realize the truth too late. They were not protecting themselves from pain. They were protecting themselves from love. And now that you've stepped into your power, they finally see your value not because you changed, but because you removed the pain that blinded it. They fear losing the version of you who always forgave them, because that version of you was the emotional safety net they depended on without ever acknowledging it. Avoidants don't fall in love with vulnerability. They fall in love with the person who makes vulnerability feel less frightening. And that was you. You were the one who understood. You were the one who softened. You were the one who didn't walk away when they pulled back. You were the one who tried to meet them where they were, even when it cost you pieces of yourself. That version of you held the relationship together, held the emotional line, and held on to hope even when they gave you nothing to hold. Losing that version of you is a devastation they will never admit, because it confronts them with the truth they fear most. They pushed away the one person who loved them unconditionally. Avoidants don't fear losing a relationship. They fear losing the role they played in it. They fear losing the emotional dynamic that allowed them to receive love without giving much back. They fear losing the comfort of knowing you would always forgive them, always extend compassion, always open the door again. When they lose that version of you, they lose their emotional certainty. They lose the identity they built in the relationship, the one who cared less, who needed less, who felt less. When you stop being the person who keeps showing up, they are forced to ask themselves a question they've avoided all along. What happens now that they aren't here to absorb the damage I cause? What shakes them the hardest is that you didn't become a different person out of anger. You became a different person because you healed. That change is something they cannot control or reverse. They realize that the person they relied on emotionally, the one who always understood their silence, rationalized their distance, and excused their inconsistency, no longer exists in the same way. This version of you no longer tolerates emotional chaos. This version of you doesn't settle for breadcrumbs. This version of you doesn't internalize their coldness as your fault. And this version of you doesn't chase the person who keeps running. When avoidants recognize this shift, their internal world destabilizes. They counted on your forgiveness like oxygen. They expected your empathy like routine. They assumed your love was a permanent resource. And now that it's not, they feel the ground beneath their emotional ego break. Because the truth is, avoidants don't want to lose you. They want to lose responsibility while keeping access. Losing access breaks them far more than losing the relationship itself. Because what they really valued was not your presence, but your softness, your willingness to love them past their damage, your capacity to understand them when they didn't understand themselves. When that disappears, they feel naked emotionally, exposed, alone, and suddenly accountable in ways they weren't prepared for. Your transformation forces them to see themselves honestly. When you stop forgiving easily, they see the consequences of their behavior. When you stop trying, they see how little they tried. When you stop chasing, they realize how often they ran. When you stop over-giving, they see how little they actually gave. Losing the old version of you means they lose the emotional illusion that allowed them to feel like the good one. In the relationship, now they must face the truth. that you were the one carrying the emotional weight while they were the one benefiting from it. The loss hits them in delayed waves. First comes confusion. Why aren't you responding the same? Then comes discomfort. Why doesn't their silence pull you back? Then comes fear. What if they pushed you too far? And then comes regret. What if you never return as the person they knew? This regret does not come from sudden maturity. It comes from the realization that they can no longer rely on your forgiveness to soothe their mistakes. They must now face the emotional reality they avoided. They hurt someone irreplaceable. Avoidants apologize not because they suddenly understand everything, but because losing the version of you who loved them without condition forces them to feel the weight of their actions. The apology is born from the fear that this time the door is not just closed, it's locked. And not because you're angry, but because you finally learned to protect the heart they took for granted. The version of you they feared losing most was not the one who loved them deeply. It was the one who'd still believed they could someday love you back the same. When that belief dies, their ego dies with it. And that moment is what finally pushes them toward accountability, vulnerability, and the apology you once begged for but no longer need. When you let go, they finally understand the depth of what they lost, because letting go is the one thing an avoidant never believes you'll actually do. They expect distance, but not disconnection. They expect hurt, but not healing. They expect frustration, but not emotional freedom. In their mind, you will always hold on to hope that they will return, explain, repair, or finally become the person you believed they could be. But when you let go, truly let go, everything inside their emotional world collapses. Not with noise, not with drama, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. They pushed away someone who wasn't replaceable. Avoidants survive relationally by maintaining a false sense of security. They convince themselves that you'll always choose them, even if they don't choose you back. This belief allows them to maintain emotional distance without feeling the full weight of their behavior. But letting go shatters that illusion completely. It forces them to confront a reality they've been avoiding for years. That love does not wait forever. That patience has limits. That hearts can close, and that silence can be permanent. And for an avoidant, few things are more terrifying than losing access to someone who once offered unconditional love. When you let go, the energy between you shifts in a way they cannot ignore. You are no longer emotionally tethered to their actions. Their silence no longer hurts the way it once did. Their distance no longer destabilizes your heart. Their inconsistency no longer defines your day. And this shift, subtler than anything you could say, destabilizes them because it removes the emotional leverage they relied on for so long. They realize that the power dynamic they once held was an illusion sustained only by your attachment. Without your emotional investment, they are left standing alone with a truth they didn't prepare for. You loved them deeply, and they let that love slip away. Avoidants feel lost slowly, but profoundly. They do not break at the moment the relationship ends. They break when they realize the relationship cannot be revived. They break when their maybe later fantasy is no longer possible. They break when the door they assumed would always be open has quietly closed. And letting go is precisely what closes it, not in anger, but in acceptance. Not with a dramatic goodbye, but with emotional clarity. That clarity is what pierces them, because avoidants fear finality more than commitment. Losing someone permanently forces them to grieve the love they were too afraid to hold. Letting go also removes their favorite self-protective narrative, the one where they tell themselves they left because something was wrong with you. As long as you were still attached, that story worked. They could blame your emotions, your needs or intensity, your timing. But when you let go, their narrative collapses. They are forced to see that you didn't lose them. They lost you. They are forced to see that your love was never the problem. Their fear was. They are forced to recognize that what they ran from was not danger, but safety. This recognition is painful because it reveals the emotional immaturity they've been avoiding. Letting go also triggers the deepest layer of avoidant regret, the realization that someone else will experience the version of you they were too afraid to embrace. They know that your heart is capable of extraordinary love, They know your loyalty is rare. They know your intuition, empathy, and emotional depth are rare gifts. And when you let go, they understand that those gifts will no longer be theirs to receive. They imagine someone else holding your hand, someone else hearing your laugh, someone else feeling your warmth, someone else receiving the emotional safety they rejected. And that thought breaks something inside them. What hurts them even more is that letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing yourself. It means you chose peace over pain. It means you chose healing over hoping. It means you chose to prioritize what they never had the courage to protect your heart. They finally see the strength you always had, the strength they misinterpreted as neediness, the strength they took for granted because you hid it under your love for them. When you let go, that strength emerges fully, and nothing confronts an avoidance ego more deeply than realizing that the person they underestimated has outgrown them emotionally. Letting go is your graduation. It is the moment you step into a version of yourself that no longer contorts to fit their fear. And it is in witnessing this transformation that avoidance finally grasps the depth of what they lost. They see it not because you tell them, but because your absence tells them everything. Your silence becomes the closure they never provided. Your healing becomes the answer to every question they avoided. Your self-worth becomes the consequence they never imagined facing. And in that moment of realization, remorse begins to form. Not because they want to come back, but because they understand, for the first time, the magnitude of the love they pushed away. When you let go, they are forced to confront the truth that they didn't lose someone dependent. They lost someone irreplaceable. And that truth, once understood, becomes the quiet apology they carry for the rest of their lives.